So welcome to the second webinar in the University Innovation Fund funded OPA NET Scotland project. This project aims to optimise industry awareness and build networks to improve the uptake of disease control strategies for ovine pulmonary adenocarcinoma. It follows on from the findings of the farmer-led Rural Innovation Support Service RIS group I facilitated with a group of Glenlivet sheep farmers who identified awareness of OPA and barriers to uptake of transthoracic ultrasound as limitations for the progress of disease control. These webinars were originally intended to be run as on-farm events, but COVID has had other ideas, but it has allowed us to open up the audience much wider, as we have over 250 registered tonight from all over the UK and even some international guests. These webinars are aimed at farmers, but we have invited vets and other industry representatives, as we feel everyone can learn from each other, and the wider the audience, the more likely we are to initiate some change or progress in this horrible disease. I'm Laura Henderson, an agriculture consultant with SEC Consulting based in Elgin. I'm joined by our two speakers, Dr Chris Cousens from Moredun Research Institute near Pennycook, who I'm sure will be a familiar name to you all, and Ed Hill, a veterinary surgeon and director of Thrums Veterinary Group in Kerrymuir. Chris will share some of the work she has been part of investigating novel diagnostic techniques for OPA during her 28-year career in OPA research, which were introduced by Heather last week, but we'll cover them in a little bit more detail this week, particularly ultrasound. Then Ed will take us through the process of ultrasound scanning for OPA screening, including covering some of the kit and practicalities and some of his own results, before discussing the applications and drawbacks.
So the title I was giving was Novel Techniques for Diagnosis of OPA. So I suspect for many of you we could actually cross out the novel, because I'm going to talk about techniques for diagnosis of OPA, and some of them may be new to you, but we've been working on a few for several years now, so they don't seem as novel as they might be. Okay, so many of you may have joined the webinar last week, in which case apologies where we go over the same ground. But just for those that didn't, or for a refresh, I'm going to begin with an introduction on OPA, Ovine Pulmonary Adenocarcinoma, or Jaagskiete. So first of all, it's an infectious lung tumour of sheep, and it's caused by Jaagskiete sheep retrovirus. And this virus infects cells in the lung, type 2 pneumocytes, or Pleura cells, and it switches the infected cells to become tumour cells. And it's these tumour cells that then produce the new virus, so essentially tumour factories, and they can infect, so they produce new virus that then infects other parts of the lung and can infect other sheep. You see here, and JSRV is transmitted mainly through the air. And of course, we all understand so much more about viruses transmitted in this way after 2 years of COVID. And of course, the same risk factors for transmission occur in the JSRV transmission as for COVID. So we're all much better educated about these things now. With JSRV, as well as respiratory transmission, it can also be transmitted in colostrum or milk, and it can also cross the placenta and infect lambs in cases where the ewe has clinical OPA. So the virus infects the cells. It starts with 1 or 2 transformed cells that then grow into bigger tumours. Here you see the brown staining of tumour cells. On the left, little tiny ones, and as those grow and fill up the air spaces, you get a large, massive tumour, and you can see that obviously there's no air getting in and out of that. That part of the lung is not doing its job. And looking at the gross pathology of the lung, this would be the head end. This is the top of the animal's back, and if the lungs weren't lying flat on a chopping board here. They would be wrapped around the heart, and all this fits inside the rib cage. And we can see it's solid tumour, and you can see here lots of little tumours from virus produced from here, starting new tumours which gradually will join up and expand the solid tumour. So that's the way it grows. And as you can see, they can grow pretty big. There is no vaccine or treatment. So in order to stop the spread of OPA, we need to identify the sheep that are producing the virus and remove them from the flock. And so how can we identify sheep with OPA? First of all, the clinical signs, as Heather described in the webinar last week, the sheep get thinner, they have trouble keeping up with the rest of the flock because they just haven't got the puff for it, and increased respiratory effort at rest. So as they get worse, they can just be standing, puffing and really struggling, even without doing any exercise. Also, bacterial lung infections are very common, so you may treat them with an antibiotic, but then the signs of pneumonia come back again, and that's an indicator that it might be OPA. And the other thing is the production of lung fluid. So this lung fluid can be a white frothy, it can have pink in it if there's secondary infection and there's blood there. And very often it's kind of the consistency of washing up liquid, but it can also be quite mucousy. It can be anything from a few mils up to half a litre a day, which flows out of the sheep's nose when it puts its head down, or when you lift it up by the back end. So in the past, the wheelbarrow test was quite commonly described as a diagnostic for OPA, but it is really quite tough on the animal, so we don't advise it these days, and normally we would only tip them in this way after we've euthanized them. So one of the things about lung fluid, or the production of lung fluid, detection of lung fluid, is that basically if you see lung fluid, then it's OPA. The positive predictive value is 1. On the other hand, if you tip them and there's no fluid, then almost a third of the time they will be negative, even though they've got tumours greater than 1 centimetre. So positive lung fluid test is definitive, a negative lung fluid test is not. So all these signs occur in advanced OPA, and by the time you get these things going on, then it's likely the animal's only got days or weeks before it lies down and dies. But actually sheep can have surprisingly large tumours with no clinical signs. So if we look at this one in the middle here, excuse me, on this right cardiac lobe, this tumour is probably about 8 to 10 centimetres from here to here. And yet if you looked at this animal, if you did veterinary clinical examination, you would not be able to tell that that had OPA. But because we know the tumour cells make the virus, it's likely that even though these are clinically well, they're probably still able to transmit infection, although they're probably less of a risk than the ones with obvious lung fluid. I should have mentioned that lung fluid is absolutely full of virus. So it is a source of infection, but also they're breathing it out as well as in that lung fluid. So if we look at post-mortem examination, this is still the gold standard test for confirming OPA. But the gross appearance of OPA in lungs is actually quite varied. So if we look at this one set of lungs, you can see on the right we have one tumour area that is dark and probably about the consistency of liver if you were to give that a squish. We've got normal lung that's nice and pink and healthy and soft if you were to feel it. In this area, we've got a kind of intermediate that if you cut across this, it would have the kind of appearance of salami. And then you've got another area that is fibrotic and feels really quite hard, probably like a tennis ball. As hard as that if you were to give it a poke. So any animal can have a number of different appearances, either all, in this case, all in one animal, but you can see these individually in animals. It may be that this is an earlier a later development of the tumour, and that the more fibrotic is later, but that's just a guess, really. So as well as that, it becomes more difficult to diagnose it from the gross pathology, because a lot of the time you're going to see them when they've been dead a while, like these lungs here. And also there can be concurrent bacterial infection. So in this one in the middle, you can see that there's probably a large abscess in the middle of that. And around the outside, there is consolidated tissue that if you cut into it, kind of has a salami appearance. And in some cases, that's OPA, and in some cases, it is inflammatory cells that are getting in there to try and deal with the bacterial infection. So in these kind of cases, it actually is impossible to look at that and say, is that or is that not OPA together with the bacterial infection? And then in other cases, there can be kind of surprising. This one, if you look from the top, there's very little OPA, but then you turn it over and there's a big tumour on the bottom. So when you're examining them, there's a lot of different things you've got to think about. And as I said, even when you've seen hundreds of these lungs for diagnosis, in fact, I've seen over probably 1,500 by now. And although I'm not a vet, I have seen very many, so I should be able to do it by now. But even then, it's not always possible to get it right. So in a group of 440 postmortems that we did, 241 of which were actually OPA, I got 3 false negatives and 29 false positives where I thought it was OPA, and it wasn't. So basically, going just from the gross appearance of the lungs, I was wrong 7% of the time. So really, we do need to use our histology backup. So just as just for a bit of fun, really, this is going to be our first quiz. So we've got a slide of 3 different panels of pictures of the gross pathology. And the question will just say, do you think this panel is all OPA, not OPA, or you're not sure?
Our
Okay.
audience tonight, for image set A, they have 65% have said yes, 19% are unsure, and 16% say no.
Okay, so the correct answer is a yes, that these are pretty much all classic OPAs, where you can see the tumour spreading into normal lung, and you can see in most of them they're in the ventral area of the lung, thinking about these being inside the sheath and wrapped around. So these would be the bottom edge, which when we come to scanning is actually quite handy, that you can find the tumour mostly in the area that you can get to for ultrasound scanning. So that's A. And
for B, the audience have said that 47% have said yes, there is OPA present, 33% are unsure, and 20% say there's no OPA present.
Okay, so this shows the value of using histopathology backup, because actually these are all negative. This one does have consolidation. It is in the ventral area of the middle lobe. And if you felt that, it feels like OPA, but actually from the histology, it's not. It's some other reason that there's inflammatory cells entering that area and making that area firm. This one here is mycoplasma. This one is a bacterial infection, a massive big abscess in there, and here abscesses as well. So B is not OPA.
And finally, C, our audience tonight, 57% have said there is OPA present, 23% have said no, and the remaining 20% are unsure.
Okay, I think probably the unsure ones are being sensible, but actually these all are OPA. There's a very small lesion here. Again, a small lesion here. So these are ones that we just happened to post-mortem and caught them early. This is also OPA. It's a very unusual presentation, but that is OPA. It's possible that there was a abscess there that's resolved, but it's left OPA in the gap. And yeah, again, this is OPA with unusually finding a lesion on the dorsal surface, as well as the normal stuff around the sides. So, so perhaps labouring the point a bit, but in many cases you literally cannot tell just by looking at the gross pathology whether or not it's OPA. I mean, these two look very similar. I already told you this one's mycoplasma because we had it in the other one, but this one's OPA. So you just don't guess, in other words, get the histopathology checked. Except the get the histopathology checked, and even then sometimes it's going to be difficult for the pathologist to tell if there's an awful lot of inflammatory cells in there. So quite often they may need immunohistochemistry to confirm it, or possibly PCR. I'm in favour of immunohistochemistry, that's what we use. The exception to the get the histopathology check rule is that when there's a significant amount of lung fluid obvious, then as I already showed you further back, if there's a lot of lung fluid, it is OPA. There's nothing, I'm told that there's nothing else in the UK that looks like that. So as long as you're confident that it's lung fluid, it's not saliva or gut contents, then you wouldn't need to go down the histopath route. So just a quick note on how to collect the sample. Heather from SAC Consulting may come back and tell me I'm wrong here, but this is how we like to collect the samples. We like a small piece across the lesion, normal junction, and then and put it into formalin. And the reason put it across the lesion and into the normal area is that you can get one that's more like this. So this would be the very solid area, which is kind of difficult to make out what's going on sometimes. And the more normal area, you can see the tumour spreading in amongst normal tissue. So that's why we prefer that. If you get an area like this where it's really difficult to tell what's going on, then immunohistochemistry can be used to label the OPA cells brown so that you can confirm that there are tumour cells in amongst a mass of other cells there. Yes, so a small piece, probably less than about half a centimetre thick. We put them straight into cassettes and put the lids on, and then you can put 3 or 4 of those into one pot of formalin. If you're working on the farm and everything gets a bit messy and you haven't got a label, then take the sheep ear tag and drop it in with the tissue. Is a very easy way to make sure that you've got them labelled. If you were taking samples for PCR, then you would take a small piece, again about a centimetre cubed or so, and freeze it as soon as possible before it starts to get degraded. So that's all diagnosis in dead sheep, but really what we need is diagnosis in live sheep, of course. So there's a number of ways that we could go about that. The first one would be to look for antibodies. This is done in so many so many tests with ELISA or AGIT or so on. So we have looked at that in the past, and I think Heather explained this last week, that basically they don't produce detectable antibodies that work in those kind of tests. So that's a no. The other type of test would be to look for either infected cells or the virus itself using PCR techniques. And we did do quite a lot of work on that previously. And what we found was as a flock test, where you test a number of sheep or test the older and thinner ones, then it's probably okay. But as far as trying to use a test to identify this OPA status of individuals, it's not so good. And that's because although it works well on advanced cases of OPA, so you could use it for confirmation of clinical diagnosis, it's not sufficiently sensitive on subclinical OPA. In other words, you can be confident that a positive test is right, but a negative PCR result is not strong evidence that the sheep doesn't have OPA. So we wouldn't advise using it on individuals, mainly because if it mostly works on clinicals and you really got a clinical diagnosis, you really don't need to spend 50 quid on a PCR test. So the other option for diagnosis is to actually look for the tumour. The first ones obviously look for viral infection. Ultrasound looks for the tumour itself, and biomarkers would look for molecules related to the tumour. So as far as ultrasound, we've done quite a lot of work on that recently, and so we would give that a thumbs up, obviously with limitations, and we're going to discuss that a lot more later. As far as biomarkers, we're nowhere near having anything useful, but it's something that we are working on, as well as also continuing to try and improve the PCR type tests, and we're also working on one related to looking for antibodies, but none of those are near enough to be telling you about yet. So I'm not going to talk about those. I'm going to move on and talk mostly about ultrasound and the work we've done on that. So apologies if you've heard some of it, but there should be something new in amongst it as well. So first of all, we want to know how effective is screening by ultrasound. In other words, does the ultrasound result match the gold standard, which is post-mortem? And so we did that by the same set of animals, same set of post-mortems that I've already shown you results for the lung fluid and for gross pathology. We compared the PM results with the ultrasound results in order to work out the sensitivity and the specificity. So, of course, sensitivity asks how likely is the test to correctly identify positives? And we see that in this group of 440, it is very good at identifying the positives. Nearly all of them are right. And specificity, or how likely is the test to correctly identify negatives, is not so good, but does the job. So, and the problem here would be some false positives, which is the nature of ultrasound. Ultrasound can only tell you that there's solid areas of the lung. It can't tell you what that solid area is. So however good you are at ultrasound, you're still going to get some that you just cannot tell the difference. So this was the results for the 440 of the post-mortems, but actually correctly, the specificity and sensitivity of any test is related to the prevalence of the disease, so it should be calculated accordingly. So taking into account that the within flock prevalence is somewhere between 0 and 5%, we calculated that the specificity is very high. And part of that is that when you take the whole flock, which has low prevalence, the chances of getting a negative result correct is quite high anyway. You could just do that by drop in a pin, or eeny, meeny, miny, mo. So the specificity is often very high in a flock with low, well, in a disease with low prevalence. On the other hand, the sensitivity drops, and that's because there are much fewer positive ones anyway. So if you miss one or two of those positives, then it makes a big difference on the sensitivity calculation. And in this case, we used data from the farms that we're working with to say how many animals became sick with OPA after the tests, and that came out at about 2.5 per 1,000 tests. So just to point out, the sensitivity and specificity will depend very much on the experience and training of the vet. I should have said already that all this work that we've done on ultrasound, I've done with Phil Scott, who is obviously probably top man in the country at ultrasound. And also along the way, by being able to do the ultrasound and see the post-mortem results, it also means that we've been able to refine the interpretation of the scans. So people with less experience, without the benefit of being able to do PMs to follow up and check how good they are at interpreting it, may not be as good at the job. Also, if there's a lot of other lung diseases present in the flock, then obviously you're more likely to get false positives, so that reduces the sensitivity. One thing to note is that we've seen that false positives are more common with less experienced scanners. So our advice would be to put all the positives aside and double check them at the end of the day when it all calms down. So Ed Hill, who's talking after me, is going to go a lot more into the practicalities of scanning, and so I suspect he'll cover that then. One way to kind of double check whether you're getting more positives than you should is to think about the prevalence. So we've found that even in farms that have quite a big problem with losing sheep with OPA, like Farm B here, the prevalence is never really that high. It's I think the max we've got is just over 5%. So assuming you're taking a whole flock and not just the group of old skinny ones, then if you were getting a prevalence above 5%, you should start to be thinking, is this right? Am I over-diagnosing? And basically to double check that you're not seeing positives when there are none. So that's false positives. As far as false negatives, so we have sheep that die between screenings, and we wanted to ask, were they missed during the ultrasound screening process, or what's going on? I mean, first of all, we should note that the numbers that die between screenings, there is a difference between the anecdotal number, in other words, the number that look like they died of some kind of respiratory problem that you may think is OPA, compared to the ones that actually have OPA confirmed by a post-mortem with histology, are quite different. An example is that we received lung samples from one of our study farms, and in 1 year they had 9 sheep that died and that they thought might have OPA. Only 3 had OPA, the other 6 had pneumonia without OPA. So it is worth following that up if you think that too many are being missed. It may not be as many as you think. The other thing is, were they really missed at scanning, or can the OPA tumours grow very quickly? And so we wanted to follow that up. And we did that by taking a group of animals to Phil's farm and then ultrasound scanning them multiple times every few weeks over this period. And what we found was that OPA lesions can actually grow very quickly in some animals. So in this group of 5 out of the 14, they grew from less than 2 centimetres to more than 4 centimetres in 2 to 4 months. So that would fit in with the fact that animals would have lesions too small to be noted at one scanning, but could develop clinical lesions in the gap in time before the next one. And just to reinforce that, we've also been able to follow growth of OPA tumours in an experimental study that we've got ongoing just now, where we stick the sheep in the CT scanner at Edinburgh Vet School every month. And so we've been able to follow from when we instilled the virus through to where we've got fairly large tumours. And so the virus was put into this region, and you can see it, nothing at 4 weeks. At 8 weeks is possibly a small lesion here. 12 weeks. So apologies, I should have said, where it's dark is normal lung, and where it starts to look solid is consolidated lung, and then we've got the heart in the middle here. So this is the tumour at 12 weeks. At 16 weeks, there's a large area of tumour here, and it's also spread to the other side. And at this point, we euthanize the animal, and you can see this is the small area of tumour in the left lung, and this is a larger area of tumour in the right lung, and this is the right cardiac lobe where we put the virus in the first place. So it shows just how quickly the tumour can grow from nothing to actually considerable size. I think I already covered that. So yeah, some might be below detectable size at scanning, but grow large in a short time. So that means that scanning as often as possible should be recommended. Obviously, there's a balance between the cost and being able to pick them out as early as possible. It may also mean that actually the sensitivity that we gave to the test is actually better than what we've calculated. So moving on to test and cull, which is the whole point of doing this. By taking out all animals with lung lesions detected by scanning, can we reduce the incidence of OPA? And obviously that has several benefits. If we can detect it early, then the animals are still well and still got good condition, so that's actually worth something to go for cull. It also avoids taking out too many that have treatable disease. So if they don't have OPA, you can look for other things that may be going wrong that can be treated. And of course, it improves sheep welfare. If they can be away for cull rather than dying on the farm, that's much better for them and for whoever's looking after them. So just to show you some of the results from the test and cull, each of these bars represents the proportion of animals positive at each scan, and each bar is a different scanning event, either a yearly or 6 monthly. So some stayed at yearly scanning, some of them were 6 monthly scanning. Some of the farms joined at the start and then dropped out for various reasons. And where you see a star is where the flock was scanned and there was no positive animals at all. So in this case, obviously you had a negative scan and then another positive. In a small flock, then even, this could be 2 animals so to get this percentage. So you don't need to have too many. But in general, what we want to show is that from the start, the number of positives has in general gone down, although there are blips, and we don't know why that is. And in some cases, in this case, the flock was negative on 4 different screenings. So obviously, if you were wanting to buy replacers, then ideally you'd be buying from a flock with that kind of profile, because there's a much lower risk of any of the sheep you buy from that having OPA. On the other hand, if one of the other farms has the breeding type that you really want, then Obviously, by buying now, when they've culled out a large proportion of the positives and the numbers are going down, your risk of buying OP out of this flock has gone down a lot compared to what it was before. So you're talking probably a fifth of the chance of getting an OPA case than you would have done before. So it seems like it's worthwhile, but it is a long-term commitment. And what we don't know is how long it would take to get the prevalence to completely zero. And that's kind of confused by the fact that nobody has closed flocks. So even if you've got your own flock clear, can you buy in tups or replaces that aren't bringing it in again as well? And the other question would be, how many negative scans would give you confidence that a flock is truly OPA free? If it was a closed flock, then, as I said, this one would give you quite a lot of confidence. Doing the stats on the results we got, basically, if all scans are negative or false positive, so if the animals are all negative, then there's a 90% probability that the flock is indeed OPA free. But that's talking about lesions greater than 1 centimetre, because we set that as the cutoff for being able to detect by scanning. So if you multiply that up over multiple years, then you've got a very high probability after 4 negative years that the flock is OPA free. So just to conclude, before I hand over to Ed, test and cull based on ultrasound has advantages, but it's also has limitations, but at the moment it's all we've got. One of the things, it's important to understand what a scan result means, so that a negative result is not a guarantee that the sheep doesn't have OPA. And it's much more important to look at the flock as a whole if you're wanting to determine with confidence that an animal doesn't have OPA. And because of that, both for the farmer paying the bill for it and for vets, it's important to manage expectations of what flock scanning can and can't do. And in the future, we're very much looking now at what we can do toward developing accreditation strategies or ultimately eradication. That could be based on ultrasound screening, even with its limitations. But of course, alternative methods or combinations of methods such as post-mortem screening or abattoir screening could also be involved in those kind of strategies. So just to mention, ongoing research at Moredun, obviously we've got lots of things going on. We're working towards methods to identify JSRB infection instead of OPA, or to detect OPA even earlier. And one of the current projects, which is linked to the sheep on the CT scanner that we saw there, is asking what's the risk of transmission from sheep with early OPA? How much JSRB do they breathe out? Because obviously that is important in eradication, and how much risk there is in leaving the ones with the early tumours in the flock. And I've got a project proposal in just now also for co-infection. So if that gets funded, that would be another thing we can look at.
Yes, Ed.
Good, nice, cool. Yeah, thank you very much, everybody. So I was asked to come along and speak this evening. I was involved in scanning some of the Glenlivet flocks that were involved in the RIS project that Laura referenced earlier. And yeah, just really talk about sort of OPA on the front line and actually applying some of the science that Chris has talked about into the real world, and some of my thoughts on it and how it's actually done. So just very briefly, a wee bit about me. I grew up on a beef and sheep farm, went to Glasgow Uni. I had my first job in Grattan-on-Spey, and since 2015 I've been here at Thrums in Kerry. We're a large mixed practice. I mostly do farm work myself, which is mostly beef and sheep. I'm sheep keen, and I finished my Cert AVP in sheep last year. And outside of work, I've got 2 girls who keep me busy. I like running and hill walking when I can, and we've got a very small herd of longhorns and a very small flock of Dorsets here as well. But yeah, I think there's probably, I think it's fair to say there's not a huge amount of first opinion vets out there ultrasound scanning for OPA yet. There's a few, which is good, but I thought it'd be useful just to reflect onto how I kind of got into it, which might sort of apply to other folks. I guess sort of reflecting back on my early experiences of OPA, so my first job in Granton, there's a number of flocks with OPA, and yeah, it really was a crippling, disheartening disease for those that it affected. It's also a constant drain on profitability, and when you sort of sat down and did health planning or discussed over a post-mortem result about OPA, and you would suggest sort of control methods, these traditional control methods that would revolve around an adapted culling policy, perhaps managing sheep in different age groups, or even total destocking and restocking, you sort of felt that advice that you were giving had a limited effect, and actually much of it was fairly impractical on farm. So, yeah, early experiences really of it just being a very frustrating disease to deal with. When I came over to Thrums, one of the trial farms that Chris has shown in those previous set of slides was here over in Eastern Perthshire. And I went along one day when the scanning was being done by Phil Scott, and Chris was there also, and just sort of buddied up and seeing what's going on, and sort of got involved from there, and sort of piqued my interest, and was keen to join in and be able to do something about it. As I said, I'm sheep keen, but I think for any sheep vet, there's perhaps limited opportunities to get onto sheep farms. So to my mind, it was an additional service that I could potentially be offering that got me onto sheep farms, kept me sheep busy. And I enjoy doing new things and keen to make a difference, so I was keen to pick up on it. I suppose in one way it's very lucky, and this is perhaps one barrier to more vets not scanning just yet, but we happen to have a scanner that was very applicable in the practice. It was bought for an equine vet to scan tendons, and I think it scanned about 2 or 3 equine tendons and sat there gathering dust. So we had the scanner, and I was able to sort of put it into use. And in sort of discussions at that time with my bosses, it was viewed as potentially an additional income stream for the practice as well. So decided that it'd be something that's worthwhile investing a bit of time into. So I think Laura has a poll for us. So just keen to find out what vets or farmers' experience of scanning are thus far. Laura.
So for our audience tonight, 49% have not scanned yet, but would like to. 26% have used ultrasound scanning in their own flocks, and 25% have said no, not interested. And then in our second question for the vets, 40% of them are not offering OPA scanning as a service to their clients yet, but would like to. 31% are offering that service, and 29% are not, but not interested.
Grand. So in terms of the actual procedure as to how to actually scan, basically, place a small amount of gel on my probe, grab the forelimb of the sheep and draw it forward, place the probe roughly a point above the point of the elbow. It does take a reasonable amount of pressure. You have to press quite firmly, particularly if the animal's carrying quite a lot of condition. You have to press pretty firmly. It helps if the sheep are wet, so if it's been raining overnight, you tend to get better contact. If it's dry, then you find that you quite often have to push a bit firmer. And basically we're scanning on the haired part of the sheep, in and around that armpit region. So placing the probe on, identifying the junction between the lung and the base of the heart, and then essentially just scanning in that small area of the adjacent rib spaces. And if you're hitting diaphragm, liver, and spleen, then you've gone too far back. And the process is repeated on the other side. And that whole process should only really take a matter of seconds, or can be done in a matter of seconds. So it's the actual sort of handling of the animal that kind of takes the time. So with a good setup, reckon could be sort of scanning upwards of 70 sheep an hour. I think I probably typically am doing something like 70 or 80 sheep an hour. I suspect with a good setup, I think Phil Scott could be scanning upwards of 100 an hour, but he's done tens of thousands, whereas I've certainly not done that many. So in terms of the kit, as I said, there was this scanner that we had in the practice that was used for equine tendon scanning. I've changed the probe on it, so it was a linear head on it. I've changed the probe head to microconvex, but it's essentially a scanner set to 6.5 megahertz, scanning at about 6 centimeter depth. Varies a little bit just depending on the breed and size of sheep. Might scan a little bit deeper for better conditioned sheep and tups. It is possible to use a variety of scanners that might be available in practice. So sort of rectal scanners for cattle, the linear scanners, particularly ones with sort of curved heads, can be used. They are slightly more challenging in that they're slightly more tricky to get into the rib spaces, and I think the quality of the image just isn't quite the same. But they can be used. But I think, yeah, if you're making a sort of decision that it's going to be something you're doing a reasonable amount of, it's probably worth investing in the kit that's going to get you the better results and is easier to use. So a couple of videos, just in terms of practicalities. I've lifted this one or clipped this one from the Moredun video that's available on YouTube. So recommend you go away and watch that in your own time. But this is basically showing Phil scanning sheep in, if you like, the traditional method. So you can see there's two sheep handlers, one holding the front, one holding the back, that then spin the sheep. So the scanner remains in the same place, but the sheep spins before getting let out. And you can see there's a team of guys behind just keeping the sheep coming up. So you can see it's pretty labor intensive. It's hard work holding that number of sheep, and holding sheep over a full day. And you do need your farmer there with several members of a team just to keep things moving. As I said, it's quite often not the length of the procedure, the length of the scanning, it's the practicalities of getting the sheep up and scanned that takes the time. But yeah, that video is there for anybody that wants to go and watch it fully. As I said, that sort of method of holding the sheep is pretty labor intensive and hard work and requires numbers and member of staff. So I've got a few farms now that I scan on that have developed a crate that restrains the animal and spins on an axle and allows access to the armpits. So it sort of negates that need for wrestling sheep. And whilst this one, you can see I'm crouched down, they've actually adapted it so that it's on a trailer or on a ramp. So actually the scanner doesn't need to crouch down. So I certainly find that using a crate like that saves my back and my knees, and my sort of shoulders and neck end up being a bit tight after a long day, but certainly saves my knees, which is good. See, yeah, you can essentially see it's an old lamb weigh crate. It's had the sides cut out with carpet on the sides that you can lift up, and a homemade head yoke. It spins on a car axle on a trailer, and it's just a wee video of it here. I guess one point, it's certainly no faster than scanning in the traditional method. If anything, it might be slightly slower. But yeah, as I say, from my experiences, it saves a lot of hard work. Cool. So if anybody's interested tonight, I've got more videos and more pictures of those crates. If anybody's interested, I can send them over. Just a couple of pictures as to what we're actually looking for on scan. So if you like, the top of the picture is the probe. Beneath that, we've got skin and the chest wall. And then the sort of key feature that we're looking for on scan is this bright white line, which is the pleura. So that's the sort of fibrous capsule around the surface of the lung. And it's a bright white line because it reflects the sound waves strongly. And then everything beneath that is normal lung. And actually this blue arrow points to the pleura again, just sort of, it's an echo, it's a reflection, so it's an artifact. But you'll quite often see that, and you'll certainly see it more strongly in thin animals where you get more echo. A couple of pictures then of what OPA on scan looks like. So most tumours will tend to be at the junction between the heart and normal lung surface. Not all of them, but that's where most of them will tend to be. And you've got a disruption of the bright white line of the pleura. You've got consolidation represented as blackness, as dark grey on the screen. And OPA will typically be sort of wedge-shaped, or will be wedge-shaped. And you'll get extra sound reflecting off the interface at the bottom of the tumour. So you get these bright white marks at the bottom of the tumour in a sort of mottled appearance around the bottom of it. Again, similar size, similar shaped tumour. We've got the heart on the right-hand side. The pleura has pretty much disappeared, and you've got this dark triangular or wedge-shaped tumour sitting there. And this one's further away from the heart, and this one you can see is much smaller. This is about 1 centimetre in size, but it's quite nice in that you can see the normal pleura to the left and right of the lesion. The pleura has disappeared where the lesion is, and it is that sort of classic wedge shape. And again, another one, very similar. But again, nice. I think this is a nice representation of just that abrupt finish of the pleura where there's a lesion. And you will see other things that are not OPA on scan. So here we've got the pleura and it's been disrupted, it's disappeared. But this lesion you can see is circular in shape. It's not that sort of wedge triangular shape that OPA will be. So this is likely to be some other cause of consolidation. And then this is hopefully fairly obviously not OPA. Again, it's dark, it's consolidated, but it's very round in shape. And you will see abscesses, and sometimes you can see these are sort of full of floating pus. And you'll see other interesting things like pleurisses. You'll see multiple abscesses and other areas of consolidation. So yeah, it can make for interesting discussions about other lung pathology as well. But I think just to flick back to that one, Chris has certainly mentioned that the risk of false positives, so over diagnosing stuff, and I think sort of reflecting on my sort of experiences of scanning, I was certainly over diagnosing stuff to begin with, and I think that's the kind of thing that, or even smaller than that, that you, as a less experienced scanner, might be inclined to over-diagnose as OPA, but could be, yeah, a historic pneumonia, lungworm, something like that. So yeah, not going to bore you with any more pictures or videos of it, but there's a wealth of pictures and videos on the NADIS website, and Chris and Phil have put together a couple of really good in practice articles that have got pictures and videos associated with it. So if you're interested and haven't seen those, I suggest you head over to those. So just a few of my sort of results from scanning. I've got about 12 flocks that I've scanned in varying stages of their journey. So some we've just scanned for the first time this year, some we've been scanning for multiple years. Some I've scanned once and then handed over to the local vet if it's been a flock out with my practice. My sort of highest percentage was about 10% in a group of purchased mules, or sorry, a flock that was in the habit of purchasing mules. They were all bought in. It wasn't just one batch. Again, reflecting, that was probably quite early in my sort of scanning career, and I may well have been over-diagnosing in that instance, I have to accept. I have scanned a flock that was 0%, and we scanned it at 0% for 2 years. It's a relatively small closed blackie flock, and I suspect they see the way the wind is blowing and have wanted to get on board with scanning, and even though it's not an accredited health status, you know, if they can say that they've been scanning and had negative results for X number of years, then that's potentially going to be beneficial for them. But typically, I think as Chris demonstrated in her trial farms, would expect to find something like 3 to 4% on a first scan. So I'm literally back from this flock today. We scanned the majority of them yesterday and finished off the job this morning. So this was about 700 blackies. Last year we got 3.5%, and this year we were down at 1.3%, which is encouraging. It's a good result. There have been, I think it's all anecdotal, nothing's backed up by PM, as Chris has obviously highlighted the importance of. He anecdotally says that he went for a very long time without any cases or deaths that he would associate with OPA. We scanned in February last year, we scanned in February this year. He reckoned by December he's had 2 or 3 cases that he believed would be OPA. So we're not quite getting them all, obviously. Another flock with quite encouraging results, slightly slower reduction in positive, but it's all going the right way. What I thought was really encouraging with this flock was this was January scans of the last 3 years. This year, the blackie gimmers, which would have all been lambs born to ewes that were scanned for the first time in 2020, were all negative. So we hopefully are therefore breeding, if not a negative flock, a very low prevalence flock, and hope starting to see the benefit of that. And then this is the flock that crosses over between the Moredun trial and myself. And this I thought I'd throw in just for an interesting discussion about the value of, or whether it's worth scanning on an annual or 6 monthly basis. This flock was scanning on an annual basis. You can see for 3 years, and felt the progress wasn't particularly rapid. So the decision was made with Moredun to move to 6 monthly scanning. And you can see that's had an impact and reduced the prevalence much faster. We haven't yet managed, because of a few things in the flock, we haven't managed to scan last year, but hopefully we'll get there soon enough and see what things are doing. You can see they've shifted back to annual scanning, having hammered it down by 6 monthly scanning for a year and a bit. For my mind, there's a few different applications of scanning. The obvious one that we've talked about is test and cull. So that's doing so in conjunction with traditional control methods. So talking about culling policies, reducing opportunities for spread at trough feeding and housing, etc., etc. But that's obviously where it's mainly used. obviously we the objective is to find these animals before they become clinically affected and still have cull value. I think it's definitely really, it's quite encouraging. At the end of a long, hard day scanning, you can sit and see the pen of positives that you've pulled out, and you can reflect on the fact that they're going to be worth something to the farmer. At the moment, worth, if they're in reasonable nick, they're worth quite a lot. And actually, whilst we don't necessarily know how quickly the disease may progress, you could kind of look at that pen and think, well, they're probably all going to be dead within a few months. And you've managed to achieve quite a lot by getting them out, getting value for them, and stopping them shedding the virus to all their mates before they do die. I put a note in there about replacement ewe lambs. If it is a closed flock that is keeping their own homebred ewe lambs, it would be ideal if ewe lambs were not retained from scan positive animals. And with an EID system, that's nice and easy, but I appreciate that most farms are not there yet, which is fine. So on a couple of farms where we scan at the point of weaning, really good top tip is just to scan immediately before weaning. Any positive cases, put loads and loads of marker paint, marker fluid on the udders of these ewes, turn them back out of their lambs, gather them back in after another couple of days, and any lambs from positive ewes will be marked on the head, and you just mark them permanently to not be retained as breeders for the future. But yeah, a couple other applications for scanning. So in this picture here, we quarantine screening. So particularly for flocks that believe they're free of OPA, and especially, I guess, for flocks where their health status is a priority, we'd always advise quarantining incoming animals and screening for disease, whether it's MV, Johne's, whatever, at the end of that quarantine period. And we can use OPA scanning at that stage to screen for OPA as well. Obviously, it's not going to be a guarantee that they are free of OPA, but you can somewhat reduce the risk. And I think if you're there advising that you're blood sampling, you might as well take the scanner and check that there's not an OPA lesion there as well. And the other place that we use it is part of a cull ewe screen. So we advise our farmers, if they're going through ewes pre-tupping and have fished out a bunch of ewes that are thin with no given reason, then that's a great opportunity to check in on the health status of the flock, and again check for things like Johne's disease or whatever. But we can scan the lungs at that stage as well, and identify whether OPA might be there or not. And if we get something suspicious, then it would always be worth confirming that with post-mortem. So there was a question, I think I saw it come up in the chat, about the cost. And I appreciate we've got a nice mix of vets and farmers here tonight. So I'd just be interested to see what people thought the value of scanning is, and how much you'd be willing to pay, or how much you feel you should be charging for scanning on a per head basis.
So 54% of our audience said £1, 28% said £2, 9% said 50p, 8% said £5, 1% said £10, and we've got a wee comment in the chat to say that the cost very much depends on the setup and the time it takes.
Cool. Yeah, thanks, Laura. Yeah, quite encouraged to see that, because actually it's that split's probably fairly close to where I charge, so I'm not doing anything too mad. For a second there, it said 100% at £5, which was nice, but I think that was the first person to vote put in fiver. So yeah, quite happy to say I charge it's £1.25, I think, per head. So that's roughly where the poll's sitting. And I guess it's got to be to my mind anyway, it's got to be a balance. Essentially, we're doing something that is pretty highly skilled. It requires some fairly expensive equipment, and at this stage, it's fairly specialist. There's not a lot of people doing it, so that's got to be paid for in my mind. And I think it's also got to be charged fairly close to sort of clinical time, so I shouldn't be undercharging what I would normally charge if I was out doing something as simple as PDing or blood sampling. That said, I think, if we're going to engage farmers to do it on a regular basis, it's got to be priced so that it's worthwhile doing, and the farmer's going to hopefully get a cost benefit from it. So yeah, to my mind, the balance of just over £1 is about right. But yeah, I was just interested to see what the general consensus was. Get rid of this. Grand. So yeah, just to finish off, a couple of reflections on scanning. To begin with, a couple of the negatives. It's quite clearly not the whole answer. It needs refined. It needs, I think, as a few of the questions and chats have been, a lot of the sense and specificity of it that we have is in the hands of one scanner, really, and it would be good to get more evidence in the hands of other scanners. And I guess the ultimate goal is more refined laboratory techniques, and I'm sure Chris and the Moredun will continue to work away on that. So it's not the whole answer, but it is as good as we've got just now. And I think there's something to be said for just getting on with what we've got just now, because this is going to be it for the next wee while. And if we're going to make a difference, then I think hopefully get more people stuck in behind it. It is physically and mentally challenging. It's hard work. I think as I've got slightly more experience, that it gets slightly less hard work, but it's certainly, it's monotonous. It's a full day or days of doing the very similar task. But then I guess a lot of what we do in farm vetting is like that, blood sampling or PDing or whatever it is lots of the same thing over lots of animals. It does require initial investment in kit and training, and I'm aware that's potentially a barrier to some practices in getting going with it. I think if the practice is going to invest in that kit and training up a vet, need some degree of commitment from their farming clients that it's going to be worthwhile the vet doing that investment, and we're going to get it back by getting the work out of it. We can't use it to reliably detect tumours that are less than the size of a sugar cube. Anything smaller than that, and it becomes fairly unpredictable as to what that is. So clearly there will be infected animals with no detectable tumours, or with very small tumours that we can't be certain about. As Chris has mentioned, the vast majority of tumours do occur in the areas that we can scan, but some will occur in the areas that we can't scan out with that sort of haired bit around the armpit. And we've already talked about the risk of false positives, so I'll not labour that point, but yeah, need to be aware of that, I think. But just to finish on some of the positives, I think as a sheep vet or somebody that's sheep keen or farm keen, it's a great new opportunity to engage with sheep farmers and offer something that there will be a number of farmers that are crying out for something to do about this disease. It's always really rewarding, I think, the time that you spend on farm, because invariably it's a long job. You're there for hours or days. Conversation will cover a huge amount, and it's a great opportunity to discuss the wider health of the flock, or indeed the cattle on the farm, and make some other changes and discuss around other diseases, other production issues. So there's value there that I think the farmer is getting as well by paying his £1.25 per sheep. Not only are we actually scanning for OPA and getting results there, but we're also talking about stuff that you'd probably be talking about your health plan whilst the vet's on farm as well. And I think the other thing that happens quite often is that you'll be scanning and you'll look at a sheep and say, oh, this one's got it. And she comes through and you scan her and she's scan negative. And you might get a few of those in a day, and actually that might be a good prompt to say, well, actually, we know from how good we are at scanning, the chances are, it's not, if she's clinically affected and we can't find a tumour, chances are it's probably not OPA. So that's a discussion to be had about, actually, let's do some sampling for Johne's disease, let's do some sampling for Maidi Visna, and check in on the wider status of the flock as well. I think at this stage, where there's not a huge amount of vet scanning, from my point of view, it differentiates me from potentially from other vets, which I think is potentially a good thing. And I quite enjoyed traveling and meeting new farmers, so I do a bit of traveling up and down the country. Not a vast amount. I wouldn't want to be doing it every week, but it's quite nice just meeting new farms and getting to know new farms. But ultimately, the big positive is sort of feel like we're doing some real good. You know, the farms that have been scanning on a regular basis for a couple of years now, definitely, whilst the percentages are going down, definitely see the benefit of it in the flock health and the performance of the flock. Yeah, just feel like we're doing some good. So I'd like to finish on that point. And thanks very much, everybody, for listening. And I think we're going to open up for questions.
Thank you very much, Ed and Chris, for those presentations. They are very interesting, and certainly stimulated quite a few questions. So we'll just crack on. I'll start with you, Chris. We've had quite a few questions come in about the results you showed for I think it's 5 or 6 years of scanning. And people would like to know if it was the same vet scanning each time. And they would also like to know if there was a little bit, if there's been any research done on inter-scanner variability and how that kind of influences your results. So if the same observer scanned the same animal, did they have the same result? Or if two experienced vets scanned the same sheep, how frequently did they agree with each other?
Yes, all our scanning has been done by Phil. We have had the opportunity to post-mortem sheep have been scanned by other people, but not from the same flock. And we did discuss actually how we could set up such an experiment. We put animals through a number of times, but we haven't done it yet.
Okay. Right, and then Ed, we've had a question. You mentioned that someone here has asked what machine you're using. You did mention that in your presentation, but what is the rough cost of them and the probes that you use?
Yeah, so yeah, I can never pronounce it, but it's like an ISO 8 or ISO 8A MyLab 5 machine. I can happily share that again if in the chat or the Q&A box if you want. And yeah, as I say, I changed the probe, so it was a linear probe that was on it, changed it to a microconvex. So I believe the machine itself probably cost about $7,500, and the probe, when I replaced it, was about $3,000. So you probably, yeah, there will be other machines that are probably slightly cheaper. There'll probably be other machines that are slightly more, but yeah, in the region of 10K, I would suggest.
Yep, it's a fair investment. But
I think, yeah, somebody in one of the boxes has said that, yeah, it's a big investment for practices and need commitment from farmers that they're going to scan if the vet's going to make that commitment. I completely agree with that. I would say that, you know, that 10K, it's not, you don't have to scan too many flocks to start getting that back, but yeah, you need some degree of mutual understanding. I think if a vet got together a group of interested farmers and say, look, we're prepared to make this investment, if you're prepared to stick by us, then that's probably a good way to go about it, I guess.
And back to you, Chris. If a sheep is always infected with JSRV, when it comes across the virus, can it fight it off at all, or is it inevitable that it will develop into OPA?
No, it's not inevitable, because in fact, a lot more animals will be infected with the virus than ever develop the tumor within their lifetime. So that's been shown by us, but also by another lab that was looking at infection. As far as can they fight it off? we actually no idea why some animals manage not to develop tumour and some do develop tumour, and that there's no obvious immunity in the normal way of responding to a virus, but there is definitely something going on, and that is another of the irons we have in the fire, is trying to understand about the immunology associated with the tumour and with the virus. But we don't have any answers on that right now.
And if you diagnose a suspicious OPA case on a scan or an inconclusive, what is the time frame that you would recommend for rescanning? Like, either of you can answer that one.
Chris might differ, but I would probably say something like 3 months. Appreciate practical sides of keeping that animal isolated, and knowing who she is to rescan in 3 months might be tricky on some farms. But yeah, I'd have thought 3 months would be fine. Certainly, I think I've had one in quarantine, a tup coming in quarantine that had a small suspicious lesion that we rescanned after a couple of weeks and it was gone. So if it was a tup in quarantine that you're wanting to get out and use, then you might rescan a bit quicker. But a few months.
Do you agree there?
Yeah, I think Phil would say something similar. It's several months. It often has to fit in with, if it's an isolated farm, it quite often has to fit in with when it's possible for the vet to get back there and look again. But a couple of months, yeah.
I think I've had this with farms that I've scanned on that are, well, to be honest, I was going to say some of these farms that I travel to, but sometimes it's more local farms where you will scan something and you have to be honest and say, this is suspicious. I can't be definitive one way or the other. And quite often the farmer's response will be, we'll just cull it. And I think you do risk culling animals that are not OPA, that have curable disease or curable or lung pathology that's not affecting them. But that, from my experience, is quite often the attitude that's taken.
And we've had a couple of questions in here, noting that pregnancy scanning was previously done by vets, but now more commonly we're seeing trained technicians. And do you think that may be an option for OPA in the future, as it may help reduce the cost rather than spending using a vet that's quite expensive, and they spend a lot of time waiting for the sheep to be presented to them?
I think at this stage, I think it's fairly clear. The RCVS guidance is that if you're putting a diagnosis on an animal, that should only be a vet that's doing it. So at this stage, I think the RCVS guidance is fairly clear on that. I do understand. I've spoken to a couple of scanners on this, and I appreciate perhaps the uptake of scanning in vets hasn't been brilliant yet. It sounds like we've got a good few that are giving it a go, or are doing it on a regular basis, even on the chat tonight, which is great. But there's certainly big parts of the country where farmers can't get immediate access to a scanner. So I think probably the onus is on the vets to pick it up a little bit. It is my personal view. I have no doubt that the ultrasound scanners, that preg scanners are highly skilled and very, very used to looking at ultrasound images. And you don't necessarily need to be a vet to be a good ultrasound scanner. But to my mind, you're making a diagnosis that has life and death riding on it, and that ultimately should be a protected thing for a veterinary surgeon, is my opinion.
Yep, and we're coming to the end of our time, so I'll make this our last question. I do appreciate I haven't posed all your questions to our speakers tonight, and we will try and get back to you. And as I said earlier, we'll try and produce a Q&A document to link the two webinars together. But what is the youngest age that a sheep can have lesions, and linked to that, what's the youngest age of sheep that you can scan?
You can scan them as young as you like. We have seen fairly often sheep of 8 or 9 months old that are positive. In fact, I saw some last week that were twins that the mother had been a clinical case of OPA, and they'd kept the lambs, and at 10 months old, they both had advanced clinical disease. So yes, it can happen, but it's much more rare than older ones.
I think, yeah, on that, I think I generally advise, since if we're whole flock scanning, it's not worth scanning ewe lambs, but scanning the gimmers that are coming in is worth it, but not ewe lambs.
Right, so thank you for answering those questions. It's certainly been a very interesting evening with a lot of good discussions. Anyone that is on the register of sheep advisors, there are points available for attending this event, so do just send me your name and membership number and we'll pass those details on to make sure you get the points. Tonight's webinar will be available as a recording next Tuesday, and in addition to the 2 webinars, we have updated the technical note, and I'll just pop the link for that in the chat, along with the link for the recording for last week's webinar. But you will also see that we're expecting to produce 3 podcasts featuring the speakers we've heard from over the last 2 weeks. So do look out for them on your podcast channels in the coming weeks. And this project has been funded by the University Innovation Fund from the Scottish Funding Council. And we hope you've enjoyed these webinars and have taken something new and valuable to your business away from them. And that is all for tonight. So thank you for joining us. And as I said, I hope you found it interesting. But if there's anything we haven't covered tonight, or you'd simply like more information on other resources we've produced, do feel free to contact me via email. Thank you. Good night.